Assalamu alaikum and good evening. On behalf of Muslim Professional Forum, I would like to welcome all of you, Muslim Professional Forum, today's discussions, Facebook Live on Islamophobia and radicalization in Western Europe in the light of the failure of political leaders. And we have today with a distinguished guest, and he will be giving a lecture on these issues. Is Dr. Tahir Abbas. Before we go to introduce our guest, I would like to say that we will be starting straight away, and after 5 minutes of my initial introduction, we will continue until 6:30, and in between, Dr. Tahir Abbas will be have a discussion about half an hour of his presentation, and then we'll have a question answer sessions. You will have the opportunity to ask the question and make a comment on Facebook Live of MPS Facebook. You can see and hear, and obviously we'll pick some of the questions from the Facebook Live, and then we'll try to answer those questions. Before we go to our introduce our guest, let me just say a few words. Today is 8th of November, every Remembrance Sunday. We just remember on behalf of Muslim Professional Forum, we remember our fallen heroes and during the First and Second World War, and also all the veterans in the UK and also Commonwealth countries. And as you know that it will be good for us to share that in the First World War, about 47,000 soldiers were killed and about 65,000 were wounded. Those were serving the British Army at the time, and about Muslims were disproportionately was involved. And during the Second World War in 1945, about 2.5 million men had fought in the war, and again substantial number of us were Muslim, and about 36,000 were killed and reported missing, and 64,000 were wounded. About 80,000 were taken to captive as a prisoner of war. So we remember them, we respect them, we show our respects and appreciation for their service, and hope that there will be no more war in our world, so we can live in peace and harmony and without any kinds of dead and wounded within our community and within our society. Let me just introduce our guest is Dr. Tahir Abbas. Tahir Abbas is an assistant professor in terrorism and political violence, Institute of Security and Global Affairs, Leiden University, The Hague. His research interests focus on ethnicity, politics, violent extremism, radicalism, and terrorism. He taught sociology in Birmingham and Istanbul before moving to Hague in August 2018. Outside of academia, he has been a senior research officer at the Home Office and Ministry of Justice and senior fellow at the Royal United Service Institutes. His recent books are Countering Violence, Extremism, Islamophobia and Radicalisation, Political Islam, and also Contemporary Turkey. He has been a visiting scholar at New York University, London School of Economics, Hebrew University in Jerusalem, Oxford Center of Islamic Studies and Institutions, International Islamic University in Islamabad, and Abbas is a fellow of Royal Society of Arts. So, Professor Tahir Abbas, welcome to you, and hope that you will have the good discussion. But before you start, I just to assure you that I have one of few of this book with me that you have written and authored, and that is much appreciated. Also, another one is written in 2005. So, thank you very much for your time. And its time is over to you, and hope that you will have a good discussion in the next 25 minutes to 30 minutes. Over to you now. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Brother Khalid, for that very kind introduction. Thank you very much, everybody else, for the opportunity to be with you here today and to talk to some of these important themes around Islamophobia and radicalization. Two areas that have basically involved my attention. I mean, it's something that I've been focusing on for the last 2 decades or so. First in the UK, and then obviously in Turkey, and more recently here in the Netherlands. And there are some consistent themes that keep running through. The idea of radicalization is often confused for many in that it's seen as a problem of ideology solely, but for the vast majority of people's experiences, it's much more about failures elsewhere in society, normally social policy failures, but also failures of political leadership. And we'll come to some of those thoughts and observations later on as we go forward. But there is an intersection between radicalization and Islamophobia that goes on here, in the sense that Islamophobia drives radicalization of vulnerable young Muslims in Britain and across Europe, of course. And this is because it plays into the fears that they have around identity and belonging, and it's something that also can be exploited by the radicalization process as well, in particular. So we have to understand that Islamophobia has many different effects in terms of radicalization for young Muslims, but also for the far right. And for the far right today, their activities center around anti-Muslim discourses. They see their activities in many ways as a kind of counter-jihad. And this is also taking a transnational feature where a whole host of different far-right organizations are working closely in alignment with others across a much wider space. I'll also talk a little bit about Prevent. Prevent has been talked about endlessly for the last, since 2006. And ever since, really, it's grasped people's attention for all sorts of reasons. I'm going to talk about that as also a sort of blame the victim pathology, where the problem is put before the community experiences, and so it becomes a really difficult situation, and then it's also turned into a kind of industry that sort of like a mill where there's a constant stream of ideas fueling the view that this ideology needs to be curtailed and communities need to work with ideology primarily. But in fact, the main problem here for Muslim communities in Europe and in Britain as well as Europe, and when it comes to thinking of far-right communities, is that there are issues of social exclusion and disenfranchisement and marginalization, and then they can become easily susceptible to external forces and interests, which is whether it's ideological or political or a combination of both. I'm always keen to try and highlight this this quote taken from the former head of the MI5, Lady Eliza Manning Buller, who's extremely brave in being able to sort of make obvious what is stated here to us all as part of the fifth inquiry into the reasoning behind the war in Iraq. And it's quite clear that the war in Iraq was systematically significant in breaking down the Middle East, destabilizing the entire areas of Iraq and neighboring countries. And of course, it's kind of led to the Arab Spring, and we still see some of the lingering impacts of what's left of Islamic State, so-called Islamic State. But it was already a problem of Islamophobia and Orientalism and negative media reporting well before the events of 9/11, and then since the impact of the Iraq War, it became much more of an issue for young folks. So I've been interested in this issue around intergenerational differences, issues around belonging, becoming, and how this is operationalized for Muslim minorities across Western Europe, with most of my work on the UK. But it's important to situate this with the changing economic landscape. So we see a shift from industrial to post-industrial societies, and that's impacting on social mobility. And then because of the downward pressures of the lack of social mobility, it means that people remain trapped in some of the poorer areas that they migrated to in the first place. So these communities then become highly observable, and then ultimately they are scapegoated on the part of different sort of policy framing that seems to suggest that there are problems within the communities that lead to problems of extremism, etc. That is a function of Islamophobia, and that creates Islamophobia in the process too. And so there are issues around lack of effective integration policies. We see today the horrors of COVID and how it has disproportionately affected some of our Muslim minority communities. And that's not a problem of genetics necessarily. It's often a problem of poverty and disadvantage and poor local services. So we have to kind of always remember that there are a whole host of historical and contemporary social policy failures that continue to permeate the picture here. Our Muslims are concentrated in the older urban areas of the country and some of the northern areas, which were homes to migrants and communities moving there for jobs in, say, the textiles and the foundries and the mills. In the Midlands, it was always engineering, motor manufacturing sector. And in the south, 2 airports were being built in the 60s, and the east end of London has famously always been a home to migrants in the past, going back 120 years. I was a student at Queen Mary 30 years ago, and it was interesting to see what life was like there then and what it is today. We see that there are Muslims across Western Europe, numbering between 30 to 35 million, and there are predominantly in old Europe, as it were, and it's linked to labour market migration histories and the guest worker programs of places like Germany, the Netherlands, and Denmark. Of course, there's a colonial link as well when we think about France and the UK, returning to the mother country, as it were, and some of the implications of racism that still linger heavily in the institutions and the very fabric of society that continue to impact on minority communities who've been settled as citizens for 70 years plus now. We see the relationship to questions of or how to think about foreign fighters and where they've come from and how they've ended up in the recent problems around Islamic State. And there were as many as 4,000 that came from Europe, and they came from old Europe, and they came from places where there's disproportionate issues around exclusion, marginalization. Young people, average age 23, 24, low education, some with a history of criminality, all sorts of motivations from adventure to ideological belief in the end of times thesis as proposed and propounded by the likes of Islamic State, etc. And also in the sense that there were other foreign fighters from other Muslim-specific conflicts that came, and we've seen foreign fighters travel from one to the other, from Bosnia, Chechnya to Iraq, Afghanistan, and ultimately some would have made it to Islamic State, but it's unclear exactly. But we now have a situation of many British citizens who are stuck in camps in Islamic State, and there are major questions around what to do in relation to their return, and this implicates virtually all of the sending countries here in terms of Western Europe. So what's going on that is consistent in all these parts of Western Europe that would persuade up to 4,000 young folks with the average age of 23 to go to a far off land to potentially die for a belief system that's greater than their current existence. And that's a question of pull and push factors. That's a question of what society does for Muslim minorities to make them feel that they are part of society enough to prevent them from going. And also there's the lure of the ideology that connects dots in people's minds, which are interpreted in a way to suit a particular purpose. And of course, it's not mainstream Islam. It doesn't reflect the vast experiences of all of the Muslim world. So is then is it possible then for policymakers to isolate this question of countering violent extremism or Islamist extremism or far-right extremism from the wider workings of society? And of course, there are wider issues around how we define terrorism and who are the terrorists, and there's state terrorism, and then there's problems in relation to the Muslim minority, and even Muslim minority in the global South. So we're talking about Myanmar, we're talking about Kashmir, Palestine, India, and China, and these are topics that are often off the table when we think about terrorism or state terrorism. And so, anyway, this is a slightly separate debate, but I just wanted to highlight the fact that when we think about terrorists, it's often who defines this. And remember, when we had the 1980s, the Mujahideen were the good guys, but it's their orphan sons who become the Taliban, which are the bad guys, as it were. So radicalization is a process. It's a social process. Some people are very unhappy with the concept itself. It means many different things in many different audiences. But for me, it's a workable concept that allows us to understand the process. And that means there's an entry point and that there's an exit point as well. But there's never really much, or there isn't enough focus on contextualizing the issues of terrorism and radicalization. We never really, so it's a deflection there as well. And there's also deflection around Islamophobia, how it fixates the policy thinking and development inside policy circles in Whitehall and Brussels, and also inside the UN perhaps. And while there's excellent research that's emerging from young scholars and established scholars pushing forward the fact that often when we think about counterterrorism policies, they don't really work. There's not enough evidence to support things like strategic communications, and even the evidence around prevent remains unclear. So all this emphasis on counterterrorism, when in fact or counter extremism, or countering violent extremism, or even countering non-violent extremism. And that's something also that's happening, where conservative values are seen as a risk. We can talk about France and Macron's responses to the kinds of things that have been going on in France and how that's potentially escalated matters. We also have these de-radicalization and countering violent industries in the academy and think tanks, and it's all about sort of generating projects to push the dominant narrative. But we never really talk about the failures of integration, the failures of equality, the failures of social justice at the broadest of levels, and the ongoing impacts of foreign policy in the Middle East and elsewhere, which is something that also to consider. Not least that sometimes the British, as well as other European powers, have used this idea of jihadism for their own purposes in foreign lands when required, and that's never always part of this discussion either. So terrorism, radicalization is a full theory. It's contextualized, it's situationalized, it's specific to individual instances. And so the research is telling us that while there are structural issues, while there are ideological issues, it's the level of the individual, at the level of the individual personal level, that we get the best, or rather the most reliable explanation that's consistent from one to the other. And that necessarily looks at social psychology as much as existent political and sociological problems. The labeling also of terrorism and the terrorists is an issue as well. Minority discourses around Islamophobia are seen as a problem for some because it's suggested as somehow masking or hiding real problems that need to be dealt with. That's not necessarily what's happening here. It's just that there are commentators who want to dismiss certain norms and values among Muslims without qualifying them or checking them further, checking them against the sort of liberal color charts, if you like. And that doesn't really quite work. But at the same time, we do know that there are these responses to by Muslims that need to be considered around how they, or how Muslims across the world, respond to Islamophobia itself. And that's something that's interesting, in that while for some it reduces people to fear and insecurity, for others it actually encourages activism, and activism inspired by Islam, and that it's trying to demonstrate. This is our recent book where we talked about the idea of political Muslims. How do you to use the knowledge, awareness, and understanding of being a Muslim in the context of being an effective citizen that participates in society and adds to a sense of inclusion for all, where no idea of Islam is compromised at any level. And in fact, it's a positive educative process for all concerned. And that could be seen as politicization of Islam at some level, but it's actually being a good human being and using the ideas that we know well in Islamic teachings about community, about neighborhood, about our identity as human beings first and foremost. It is a social problem. It remains a social issue. It's a problem of aspects of society breaking down. But politicians don't want to talk about that. They want to deflect attention away to crises such as immigration or cultural differences among certain groups. And this is sort of this nativist, populist nationalism that we saw historically now in the peaks of Trumpism. Although Trump is out of the picture, Trumpism will remain for a little while, undoubtedly. But that was very much something that was a problem in America, but also exported to Europe. And Brexit also has this air of populist nationalism that's undercutting the political discourse. But all the time, there are widening social inequalities. So the rich get richer far faster than well, everybody else, of course, but the poor are continuing to get poorer relative to everyone else too. So we see these kind of widening gaps, although there's been some bridging due to some impacts around the decline of the extent of the austerity program. But austerity was devastating for communities up and down, north and south, and it's added to that disenfranchisement, to that sense of disaffection that's affected folks in the north of England who were the Red Wall, but had turned pro-Brexit, for example, and that's similar to what's happening in America. That the people who voted for Trump were the poorer, less educated, disenfranchised folks who believed what they hear from their politicians. So there are these identity questions, and identity around self and other. The idea of the self is not as important in the global East or the global South as much as it is given absolute primacy in the global North, i.e. the individual, the sense of individuality, who I am, etc. Whereas the Muslim world, certainly, and in the Eastern world, of course, the values around the greater good have always been stronger and greater and more influential in how we see ourselves and how we relate to each other. And so these tensions between this construction of the self and the other that exists for Muslim minorities leads to tensions, particularly among the young. And that's where we get this idea of intergenerational disconnect. So every generation, you're going to get intergenerational disconnect unless we smooth out this process a little more. And the things that smooth out this process are awareness, self-awareness, education. But we also have to kind of turn away from some of the more distinct practices within our South Asian religio-cultural fabric. So we're talking about patriarchy, we're talking about particular issues around spaces for women, but there have been massive developments in the last few years, and the kind of movements we see happening now are being led by women and young people far more than ever. So there are these kinds of considerations, but it's at odds. So, for example, who suffers most from everyday Islamophobia in Britain? It's visible Muslim women who are often the targets, often by white English men, who are older, and that's the average Islamophobe and the average Islamophobe victim, if we try to generalize. So these kinds of divisions are clear enough in terms of how we perceive each other, but also in terms of this issue around conflict. So identity is key at the level of the individual, at the level of the local, national, and global. And this is important for far-right issues as well as our Islamist issues. And so with new research going forward, I'm interested in trying to understand the sort of interrelationships between these two types of extremisms in local area urban contexts, and how the issue of social exclusion is, in fact, the main explanation for it. So if we think about working on social exclusion, i.e. think about inclusion, it's no real brainer here to think that people will start to trust each other more, relate to each other more, engage each other more. And of course, when we know that the people talk to each other and understand each other by talking to each other, that's when we build relations and positive human experiences. And that's absolutely not happening right now because of a wider political discourse, but also an economic problem of the poor and the rich, the disenfranchised and the wholly franchised, and who feels they have a stake in society and who feels that they're above some of the laws in society. And we see effectively what's kind of plutocratic, oligarchic tendencies. Basically, rich people or a bunch of rich people, and rich through businesses, through institutions, etc., are making or having a powerful say in the making of policy decisions. That's Trumpism. It's also what's been behind some of the issues around Brexit as well. Identity, status, belonging, lack of agency, lack of voice at the center, anger at the margins. This is what relates to two types of problems of extremism. So if we think about reversing these, we can think about extremisms for all. Space is interesting in the sense that these are urban phenomenon that's being discussed here. And this idea of cumulative extremism occurs in this urban space, but it's in the context of cumulative polarization, which is at the national level. And that's through our discourses, i.e. the media and the political landscape. Okay, I just want to then, just to emphasize a few points around the need for acceptance, the idea of separation. These are some of the things that define extremisms across the world. And we have to also work on some of those ideological parameters through education. And when we know that people have access to a broad, all-encompassing, empowering, iterative appreciation of Islamic knowledge, it empowers people. But we can also see the same knowledge base being abused in a way to disempower people and turn them into unthinking robots who could potentially be activated, as it were. So we have to work on ideology at some level, but it's not that the primary focus here. And if we don't do anything about all of the other social policy failures, we're not going to get anywhere with tweaking with ideology, because ideology has always been there. It's always been there on the part of groups who are disaffected or angry about what they are experiencing, and they place emphasis on people in positions of power and authority who are making decisions that they will resist and in some cases fight against. And some of those are often legitimate concerns. And that's why we don't want to generalize extremism as entirely structural issues. We do understand that there are legitimate issues that need to be understood for what they are. I'm going back to the idea of state terrorism. Terrorism is often done, obviously, for a purpose, for the event itself. And if there wasn't any reason for that event, we wouldn't get some of those issues of terrorism. That's all of this stands to reason. The prevent agenda, nothing too much to say. That hasn't been said much before. It securitizes. It stops. It's a kind of what we call a suspect paradigm, where there's a blanket generalization of Muslims. It uses Muslims as kind of community-led surveillance, certainly at first, and perhaps less so now. And it still doesn't always get it right. And there are huge problems on university campuses with students feeling that they can't speak up in class or among their peers outside of class in case they get reported. And the training provided to teachers and university academics is far from adequate. And there's always there's always issues that minorities face on campus anyway, but this is further heightening this. Some new research I've done on this on university campuses in the UK. But the British government are very positive about the success of Prevent and continue to see it as a kind of major export in the counterterrorism industry. And we do have variations on it. And while it does sort of potentially tick lots of boxes, the evidence remains patchy, and we still need much more understanding of what's happening with it, and why it's still continuing to create so much tension among Muslim minority experiences. So it's a failure, to be honest, and that's around domestic policy and foreign policy, and it's the ill-fated combinations of local problems and global problems hitting us at the national level, and that's a function of poor economic policy, poor social policy, wider public policy that has not focused on nation building in the way that might have happened, perhaps even theoretically, because the policy paradigms we've seen that are fully in operation today were in the making in the late 1970s. Sort of neoliberalism and rolling back the frontiers of the state, privatization, etc., deregulation of the financial markets were all something that most of Western Europe, and particularly the Thatcher-Reagan era, pushed forward in a big way. But ever since then, even with New Labour, which was a good first term until the event of 9/11, of course, the situation today under the Tories, rather unfortunately on balance, has not been entirely favourable. So local area problems can only have local area solutions. You start with the local, you're going to get much further than if you do with starting with global problems. Social cohesion, identity, political participation, citizenship, becoming, being, belonging, feeling that you're part of society, taking part, and feeling safe and secure about it are important considerations. And then obviously there is a mess still around economic inequality, the political polarization that's been pushed forward through populism, authoritarianism, nativism, and we still have pretty tense debates around immigration and diversity. Although it's interesting that after the Brexit vote, that people's understanding or awareness or their sympathy, as expressed in surveys, grew. So among society as a whole. So, but the poorer, less educated folks among our society or Britain were still less receptive to it. So that's where we got a real problem. Poor people who left behind with limited opportunities, or angry and frustrated with limited educational resources at their disposal too. That seems pretty straightforward to focus on. And if we target that blanketly across all communities, north and south, east and west, it builds societies from below, and obviously ensuring that we restrict some of the excesses above society, as it were. Okay, so essentially that's all I wanted to whiz through. I hope it was reasonably coherent. More than happy to answer any questions or queries, and looking forward to any discussion points. So thank you again.
Professor Tahir Abbas, thank you very much for your eloquent presentation, and it was very thought-provoking, and obviously, and some of the things was you discussing is already in wider political debate, and some of the things is come out is new. That is something we need to explore further. And I have a few questions to you, and I can see that in Facebook there is no question until now, but I'll request those are watching on the Facebook Live, you can ask the question direct, and we'll pick up some of the questions so that our guests can answer the questions. But I have some questions for you, and I'll obviously, as a way of my style, what I do, I just pick a few points from your book. I just previously refer you that is this from this book, Islamophobia and Radicalisation. Is written recently in 2019, and I'll quote from here on page 6. You just mention something, because obviously focusing on race, immigration, politics, and obviously all these things, and also international politics, and how this foreign policy things paradigm is affecting us in the West. And in somewhere he mentioned something like relations between race and nation began to converge with ideas of citizenship, belonging, and identity, promptly taking a foothold in the context of seemingly endless challenges facing European states as they wrestle with nationalism, and competing interests abroad. In this context, outsiders were not only different between because of their allies' inferiority, they are also a threat to the nation itself. And the things we just discussed now, and then written in here, and how do you think this feeling, this kinds of one way competing in the global political establishment and in their hegemony, and the same time, like us and them, and how these things mental setup of the political leaders in the West, especially the Europe and in the UK as well, unfortunately, in affecting this Islamophobia and also moving radicalization as well.
Well, I mean, I think that it's, the issue there around how Islamophobia is instrumentalized by Western elites within this kind of context of global kind of neoliberal paradigm is that it's rather convenient. It sort of, it works. And I think, you know, this works politically. It works politically because it's so easy to target Muslims. And we see many different experiences across the Muslim world that are you know, a story that continues to be built up in terms of the dominant narrative. And the dominant narrative is that that Islam and Muslims are backward, regressive, violent, reactionary, and constantly when these issues are fed back into this media cycle and the political cycle, it sort of reinforces the idea. Well, of course they are, and then without challenging it, it's there as a useful tool to whip up the kinds of sentiment that we're sowing the seeds of division. And I say this in a soft way because it's not totally malign. They're doing it for self-interest reasons, but it's something you can do by working through the logic of what works for you electorally, and that's something that we always see almost in every general election in the UK in the post-war period. The question of immigration comes up. And it's part of the political sort of focus at any one point in time. But what's happening in terms of the geopolitical alignment is that there are the neoliberal paradigm. You know, everybody, everywhere, every nation has embraced capitalism. Even China is the most capitalist country in the world. And the consequences of capitalism is that you need to be able to sort of continue to exploit and sort of seemingly get as much advantage out of that process. And in today's world, the Muslims are exploitable and are being exploited, whether it's resources, whether there's them as populations, or whether they're here in Europe and as Britain as minorities. And all of that sort of seemingly conveniently come together.
Well, in terms of the, thank you for this answer. In terms of you mentioned something that the about belonging and acceptance. Okay, in terms of the acceptance, and obviously, how is going this acceptance with the notion of multiculturalism? Because obviously, you touched on this issue about the Bradford riot. You touched about the Birmingham minorities issue. I'll try to ask the question about the Bradford specifically end of this session before I end. And how do you see this acceptance and the multiculturalism? Is there any
Yeah.
way is it clashing with the British value and Western value, or is something is a
Well,
potential to go hand in hand for the harmony of society, rather than a big society or monoculture? That is something
yeah.
always proposed that should be part of the process for social cohesion.
Yeah. Well, the big society, it sort of floated like a big lead balloon. It didn't go anywhere. It was a really ridiculous idea. This idea of one nation ism doesn't really work. So the idea of multiculturalism, and it's a great idea on paper. It's a wonderful philosophical method of thinking through how we want to see diversity, differences in society working out. And that means appreciating that there's going to be historical issues with people's migration histories in terms of as subjects of colonial experiences coming into the mother country, and what we need to be sensitive to in terms of race and racism. There will be some cultural norms and values which might be seen as different, but we can work with differences so as to find commonality and consistency among a general sort of appreciation of who we all are as citizens of the state. So it's great on paper, and it does work, and it does work pretty well in Singapore and actually in Indonesia, where it's kind of Singapore. It's kind of in the constitution almost, and Indonesia by this idea of unity within diversity and diversity within unity. It's sort of the different religious faiths, cultures sit on top of each other comfortably. The problem with Britain is it's a former empire, a former colonial power, and some of the issues of racialization and systematic institutional racism are still in our society, and yet you are inviting at first minorities to work in the. It's not like the American migration post 1965. If you had the PhDs, the kind of the science degrees and so on, you went to the USA for a professional employment contract, and we see extremely middle class Muslims in the USA. Whereas in Britain, we were invited to do the jobs that nobody else wanted. So we start off from a position of being former colonial subjects and then ending up at the bottom of society as labor workers. So it's much harder to move up those steps of the ladder. But at the same time, majority of society is of the view that these former colonized immigrants are going to be here to do this dirty work, and they'll be gone when the work is over. So there was always racism, there was always racialization to be had before even migration started. So, and if we look at fast forward today, if we look at surveys around how British Muslims feel, they feel very British. And the idea of being British is the idea of different nations coming together under an umbrella concept. And for all of us who are born in England, we can easily call ourselves British. But how many of us can call ourselves English? And that's because Englishness is, we got problems of whiteness and sort of how whiteness and Christianity are coming together for far-right groups. But we've also got Englishness, and it's seen as an Anglo-Saxon heritage. It's about your race, it's about your blood. So that's how powerful that identity is and how difficult it is to break through it. Whereas if you're a Muslim born in Glasgow, you are very Scottish, and you have no problems feeling Scottish, and nor do other people. Other Scots, etc. It's the same with other parts of the UK. So there's something distinct about Englishness and what it means for minorities, and particularly minorities from our particular histories.
All right. Thank you for this for a long the answer of this issue. I think this is fascinating that yes, it is possible. My understanding, it is possible, as you said, that it is working in Malaysia and other countries as well, and is possible in the UK. Is to change the mindset and the policy, because if we're able to change our mindset, if we're able to change the policy, give the opportunity, it is possible to live side by side, and because the culture and ideology and religious difference will remain because it is something inherent. And but in this context, we can work together, accepting each other differences. And if this is accepted, then we can go hand in hand far away. So in terms of, because of these things, of the timing shortage, I want to ask the question specifically in this regard about the Bradford riot in 2001. You just touched on in your uh, this book of the commentary and also a discussion as well. And obviously, we know that Oldham, Burnley, and Bradford, and that represented the violence which saw hundreds of young Asian men of Pakistan and Bangladesh who took the stage. And especially the Bradford one was the violent one. That was on 7th of July 2001. That was the worst violence erupted in Bradford. About 1,000 young men brought widespread destruction of the properties and also the police involved, and some 120 police officers injured, and violence went rocked to the whole country, the whole debate as well. And obviously, you fully aware that the Ted Cantrell report following this violence, and he just suggested the few recommendations, and it was about 67 recommendations, and he just recommended on housing, youth generation, politics, and education. And Cantrell report called for an open and honest debate on the nature of multicultural Britain and what should be done to foster ties. Do you think we learned anything from there, or any implementation has been implemented?
So it's very interesting. Remember, these northern disturbances happened just a few months before 9/11, and so it's in that summer. And then when the community division reports came out next year, I remember I used to work in the Home Office in Whitehall, and when 9/11 happened, and then what came afterwards, etc., in terms of the direction to lots of different policies. And I've had this discussion with Ted Cantrell on many platforms over the years. I think he's retired now, but it don't seem so much. But it was the emphasis on values, that if you somehow were able to have friendly chats and cups of tea with your neighbors across your garden fence, that somehow that would be enough to fix all our social problems. And while, of course, some of that is very, very important, and that's absolutely logical and reasonable to expect things like that, to trust each other and to have a shared set of understanding around things. It's being neighborly, but it's the political polarization. It's the division we are faced with in our newspapers and our discourses and our media and our television and our film and so on. And without meaningful investment in education, jobs, you're not going to get that kind of progress. And so they were let down badly. In the 1980s, we had the disturbances in Handsworth and Toxteth. And Lord Scarman produced a report in 1982 for the Tories, and he said, look, we've got policing issues, police harassment issues, massive youth unemployment issues, and we've got racism issues. That's what's happening, and what we need is major investment in the inner city areas, which are declining. Nobody's doing anything about it. It's where the minorities who first migrated to are still stuck, but there's nothing for them, and you're fomenting anger and frustration, and without change, it's going to lead to major problems. There wasn't really that much investment. The urban program, headed up by Lord Heseltine now, did some things, and some good things and some less good things. Perhaps a longer debate about that sort of housing policy. But this issue of 2001, and I just want to say this, that there was nothing done for unemployment, for education, for investment in business and jobs and industry and commerce, because the North has been always lagging behind the South, and that just has grown and grown and grown under the last 40 years, and even now when we see the kinds of North-South divisions over COVID. So I felt it was unfair, and it was not really addressing the problems. And remember the first Labour term, 97 to 2001, they put multiculturalism, diversity, equality, the Race Relations Amendment Act, the Human Rights Act at the top of the domestic political agenda, and they put a lot of money, by stealth often, because they didn't want to lose their slightly sort of to the right, liberal leaning. They put money in education and health big time. But then obviously with 9/11, the whole thing changed. Everything changed. The rules of the game changed.
Right. Thank you, Tahir, for this answer. I just to come to your home country and hometown. I understand that you was born in Birmingham, also raised there, and also studied there. And this is a recent issue which ongoing about the Birmingham. Obviously, you understand about the probably I'll ask the question about Trojan horse. Probably you
Yeah.
understand and hear about this in 2014. It was unfolding on the basis of a anonymous letter from somebody, and it is transpired that it was a government issue and became a story about the extremism.
Yeah.
And recently, the 6th of November this month, BBC Channel 4, Radio 4, that give about half an hour corrections on these issues. And it was researched by one of the researchers from University of Birmingham, Dr. Raza Galami.
Yes.
In terms of your research in your own town, do you think this, when this story went to media, part of the media, they failed to understand or failed to apply their due diligence, failed to journalistic ethics, and to invent this word of extremism and plot? And do you think these kinds of stories by the medias contributing to negative portrayal of Muslim and also pushing toward the youth to radicalization?
Yeah. In short, I mean, the journalist in question here, Andrew Gilligan, who wrote a series of articles in the I believe the Sunday Times and the Telegraph,
About
constantly
40 stories by
how
Sunday
many?
Times. About
Yeah,
40.
yeah. Andrew Gilligan is somebody that I've had recent relations with. My colleague Sadiq Hamid and I, we were our tweets were examined for our anti-Semitism. Let's just say. But the point is, it was. Look, there's lots of issues. We've got to think about who the Secretary of State of Education was at the time, who his special advisor was at the time, Dominic Cummings, Michael Gove. There was a particular agenda, a particular fight between him and Theresa May over as to who owns the counterterrorism bag in government. So there were Whitehall issues. And then we looked at these schools. Now, I wrote about some of this, and I talked to some of the people involved and some of the people affected. So the issue is this, that historically, the sociology of education debate was like, oh, the reason why we get poor performance among our minorities is because they come from these poor, underprivileged backgrounds. They don't have esteem. They don't have motivation. The parents don't know the language. It's their limitations. What the people did in those schools, and there were a bunch of schools, they took that model and completely put it on its head. The same poor, inner city kids whose parents perhaps don't have the language or education or even the employment status. And they gave them discipline, they gave them self-confidence, self-reassurance, and their education levels improved dramatically. And that was because of giving them confidence and belief and a system of learning and evaluation. And it completely tore apart this education model. And I think they were a victim of their own success. And perhaps there were a few people who might have sent a few crazy messages in WhatsApp groups, but this was not about a systematic plot to Islamize kids in Birmingham schools. It was not at all. And the damage it's done to thousands of kids and to the whole sort of profile of Birmingham as a no-go area, Sharia patrolled zones and things like that. It was very damaging and destructive in all sorts of ways. And this, the media was absolutely to blame. But again, also the political discourse behind the scenes in sort of the Whitehall machinery is also important to understand. And yet, these are Muslims who are taking part in.
Can I just stop you there? Then I think I got the answer already. Okay, thank you very much for this. I think so. We have lots of questions coming in Facebook. So I want to ask you some of the questions. Otherwise, our audience will be upset.
Oh, apologies.
The one question come to our comment box. Should the terrorist be labeled with a prefix as a Muslim? A terrorist is a terrorist. Likewise, the terrorist is a racist regardless of color group they may belong to. So obviously, whenever you see something that whoever done these kinds of crazy things and he's happened to be a Muslim, straight away come as a terrorist.
Yeah.
When somebody is not a Muslim, it's something else.
Yeah.
So in terms of this labeling about Muslim, about like a terrorist as a Muslim, how we can come out from this labeling and this kinds of mental and mindset from the media and also in general public as well, because this is become a general paradigm, a general narrative.
Yeah, well, it's journalism and writers and editorial decision making, and it's newspaper writers who don't get out of London, and it's really group thinking. And I think it's also some arrogance because they think they understand the problem better than sociologists, historians, political activists, politicians, people on the ground. And that, so it can't be just anything more than that. I mean, it's every day, and it's consistent, and it's something that we're working to find some evidence on, because when there's a far right attack, it's always about the individual, had a terrible upbringing, how could society have damaged him, for example. Whereas if it's a Muslim, the whole of the religion is questioned, and that's consistent. So that's Islamophobia for you.
Okay, thank you. In terms of the Islamophobia, there is sometime you can see that when the election is come, we obviously touched upon that politicians bring up about immigration, and often they sometimes use about the terrorism and Islamophobic issues that is touching. And do you think that in the Western world at the moment, because of this COVID situation and economic downturn, and Islamophobia is becoming a part of political game for some, and to obviously we can see in the last 4 years in US. And how do you want to comment about this along this line about the US election? Do you think any transitive change, something positive change coming from US politician on the new tenant of White House?
I think when we think about US politics, we've got lots to look forward to. Although Biden and Harris have got major uphill struggles. Biden's already said, I don't want less Islam, I want more Islam in schools. He's already said this. The Muslim ban, gone. It's one of the first things he wants to do. He's a consensus builder, and he's an experienced veteran politician. Now, the case with Kamala Harris, she could be the next president in 2024. And she's very capable, and we're going to see great things coming out of America right now. Anything's better than what we've had with Trumpism. But the impact of Trumpism will linger for a little while, because it was so deep and so divisive. But I think these two new politicians and the Democrats will try their best, although they don't have all the numbers in Congress, and that's going to limit them, and they will face uphill tangle. But at least we'll get proper politicians who are on the global stage and not an embarrassment for all of us with thinking minds.
Well, thank you. And I just come to go to now France. Obviously, you see that Charlie Hebdo cartoon is now re-emerged in the last 2 weeks and 3 weeks, and unfortunately, there are some fatalities in there. And obviously, Muslim professional forum condemned this already. But do you think the France, the secularism, and what is we used to think that it is allowing space privately for the religious practice to be performed? And in terms of the state sponsoring and allowing this cartoon to be projected in the government buildings, how this is damaging for the community cohesion in particular France and Western Europe, and also how it is pushing forward the young generation to taking their own particular interpretation of the situation.
I mean, I think the recent French case is sadly a perfect example of how Islamophobia affects radicalization, and how radicalization affects Islamophobia in the discourse sense. Macron made some very heavy statements and very blanketing, generalizing, and he knew what he was doing. It's all been well documented now. He was tilting to the right. He's trying to muscle into the EU now that the UK is muscling out, and the position in Germany is weakened for Angela Merkel because of, again, far right problems there, which have become mainstream. So his statements were way too bullish, or way too aggressive, and we got teenagers who then took instruction somehow or another, and were able to do those things that they did. And there's 6 million Muslims plus, maybe 7. They're not really getting much of a recognition in society. There's always been problems with France when it comes to its Muslim populations. Not now, not the last decade, last 2-3 decades. There are always these issues, and 40% unemployment rates for French Muslims. Even secular French Muslims get discrimination experiences. It's a real mess, and the idea of secularism works on paper, but not if you're Muslim in France.
Thank you. And I have a few other questions as well coming from Facebook as well. This one question is the one participant asked about when you take about the Muslim, some of the young Muslim, and obviously the religious text and literature is widely available. That's a good things, and some sort of the intellectual discourse and also a revival is coming to Muslim world and Western Europe. Do you
Yeah.
think this is any way or shape the interpretation of the holy text? It sometimes go out of context,
Yeah.
and how this is the responsibility of the intellectual, those are scholars, to keep a lead on it.
Yeah. Yeah, it is absolutely right. I mean, I think this revivalism has been a major problem. It's become violent and aggressive and transnational. But we are not always, the Muslim community is not always resourced and equipped or has the capacity to step in when it comes to young people asking tough questions that are difficult to answer. And that's where we lead. We get those tensions and those gaps. And we've got to introduce much more critical thinking and much more awareness into our mind. I mean, this is a constant thing about how we look at religion. Is it fixed in faith? Is it fixed in time, or do we interpret it in context? It's been a debate throughout the ages. The rationalists and the traditionalists, and the traditionalists won when all the scientific knowledge was sort of undermined by various historical processes. So we're still struggling with critical thinking, critical engagement, critical science, and that's important in the Muslim world, in the Muslim mindset, and the content of our curricula is still a little bit outdated. The basic essence of our faith is straightforward to learn, but to be able to use that and apply that in the context where it's a different home, as it were, it needs a bit more education and a bit more knowledge. And we're slowly building those institutions, especially in the UK. I know there are in a Muslim college and other institutions. For example, there are the Aga Khan University. We have institutes of Ismaili studies. There are so many different institutions trying to kind of build up a knowledge base, which is great, but it's not mainstream enough, and it just still. And that's because a lot of the kind of gaps in the knowledge is the reason why these kids go online looking for things that their elders, so-called elders, can't give them answers to.
Thank you very much for this. Is lots of tough question coming to you, and also obviously coming to our end of our discussion session. We have another 10 minutes. We will continue. Before I do so, I have a few other questions as well and to ask as well. Obviously, you touched about the prevent, and obviously it's become a toxic some sort of discussion when it comes to the intellectual level. People like you, those are researching. Do you think that this prevent strategy prevented any of the terrorist activities so far happen in London since 9/11 or 7/7? And if not, what the Home Office Secretary of State should do to the Muslim community, because that's going on. Its suspicion is around since it is become a prevalent strategy to counter the extremism and radicalism.
Well, I believe Jeremy Corbyn wanted to get rid of it, and I think there's a lot of criticism. The thing is, prevent is I remember I had a conversation with a senior prevent wala, and he said, "Of course it's working. We stopped 300 young people going to Iraq, Syria to join Islamic State." I said, "Okay, what about the 800 that you didn't prevent? How does that work? I mean, how can you say that it's actually a qualification of the policy working?" The only stories we hear are negative stories. I know there are some folks who have sort of bought into it a lot more, and I think there are some smoother edges around its application in places, but I think some of the logic behind it is still deeply problematic, and we need to revisit this completely and think about this from the bottom up altogether very, very differently. But who's going to do this? Who's going to do this? The topic of our talk? Where is the political leadership to do that? We tried to get Islamophobia on the table. I remember talking to various colleagues, Baroness Marcy, Baroness Paula Odin, or Nazir, the APPG on definitions of Islamophobia. A fantastic report, great effort, completely dismissed. All the evidence is there. It's damaging, including this sort of whole counterterrorism sector. Baroness Farsi's book is also very good around how Islamophobia and counterterrorism will go hand in hand.
In terms of this Islamophobia issue, then obviously you touched upon. I wanted to ask this question about the FAPG definition of Islamophobia, and obviously in the UK also we have the awareness program month. The November is mainly Islamophobia awareness month. There are lots of things are going on, lots of activities happening. But do you think it is in any way, in terms of proportionately, that the issue of Islamophobia is reducing, or it not really having any tangible impact in reality?
I mean, the problem is it's so deeply, the tentacles are so deeply hooked into the workings of society. I remember during the lockdown phases, I thought there's no radicalization, there's no Islamophobia in the news every day. And then the French case happened, and we had 2 weeks of the crazy stuff. So it hasn't gone away. It's still there, buried away for now. And it needs proper addressing. And I mean, it's the kind of things we need to talk about, that we've talked about: education, awareness, policy, a vision, and activation, top and bottom. And that's just not there. It's not there. It's not here in the Netherlands either. We had a case in Rotterdam about this, when again a teacher showed an image of a cartoon about the Prophet cartoons, and some Muslim girls got upset. And then next thing you know, we hear that the teacher is in hiding, and then we have national TV debate programs around the risks of Islamism in our schools, etc., and things like that. So it's everywhere. It's a disease that spreads very quickly, because I think it's too easy to buy into this discourse.
Well, I have a last two questions to you. The short question: in terms of the terrorism and radicalization, obviously you have a long research on this field, and obviously sociological field. You're doing lots of work on it, and we very much appreciate your time today. Do you see any correlation between the background, family structure, financial situation, or educational level that is driving in any way? Any correlation is not something instant. Do you see any correlation between this level of status of an individual person, or going into the wrong way to become a problem for society?
So it's a really important question, and I've got some research ideas that I'm currently exploring. And so we talk about the structural and we talk about ideological factors, okay? And somewhere in the middle is a person who gets radicalized. But that person is often a part of a family and part of an intergenerational family, household dynamic. So I did a study with one of my students here in she's a German Turkish student. So we did some work in Düsseldorf. We found Moroccan families, and we found Turkish families in the same area, so the same sort of consistent sort of variables. So we can do a like-for-like comparison similarly. And so the problems in Europe about extremism are to do with Moroccans in Belgium, France, the Netherlands. But the problem of when it comes to Turkish families, and there are 4 million in Germany, and Turks are the biggest minority in the Netherlands, there's no radicalization issues. So what is it then? It's Muslim communities, they're minorities, they're sons and daughters of industrial workers, factory workers. They're in urban areas which are facing often decline and exclusion. And yet we see very different patterns for Moroccans compared to the patterns for Turks. So we concluded that it's got to be something to do at the level of what's happening, knowledge within the home. Not to say that these kids are learning Islamism or extremism from their parents. Far from it. It's the parents not able to fully connect with the young people's needs in the way that, for example, the Turks can do that and the Moroccans can't, means that we have these differential outcomes. So we can, therefore, I mean, it's another question, society and racism and institutions. We as Muslims and our communities and our families, we also have to do more to be sensitive and appreciative of the changing dynamics of the lived experience for our young people today. Now, it doesn't mean we have to change our norms and values or adapt them. We just have to keep up to date and keep in tune, and so as to ensure that your knowledge, your expertise, your elderly status, as it were, gets transmitted in a way that's effective. So there are these things, and the Moroccans don't have the same kind of religious organizations that the Turks do. So the Turkish have a very distinct foreign policy around religious organization in Germany and Netherlands. They have a ministry responsible for this, and they even have their imams trained in Turkey, who are then sent here. And then the khutbah is extremely well regulated as well. So I know the Moroccan community here suffer the most when it comes to the level, the negative label of Islamophobia and the problems of extremism. So there's something distinct going on here in Europe that I'm interested in to explore further.
Thank you. Because of the timing, we have to just remind our audience as well, for us as well. We have about 5 minutes to wrap up this session. Obviously, we're going about 15 minutes, 10 minutes over nearly the time. But I have my final question to you before I hear from your final thought. Obviously, you touched this in your recent book, as I just previously showed, Islamophobia and Radicalisation. You touched upon the Muslim community and the division within our community itself. And you obviously mentioned about the Muslim with grudge and other Muslims quickly blamed to rivals. You mentioned about the Wahhabi, the Wandi, and other sects and tablighs and everything. What do you think that Muslim community leaders should do? Because it is not something, the problem that Muslim community is only facing. We are part of it as well. That those are involved in here. They are somehow, our neighbors, our sons, or some sort of relatives as well. Those, whatever way they're involved. So in terms of the community leader, what do you think that Muslim community leaders should do? One. The second thing is how they can resolve their internal divisions so that they can come up as a solid Islamic organizations or representative body for the Muslim community, so that you can see that they are working for everyone, not only just any particular group or any particular ideology.
Yeah. Well, when Muslims first came, and we have Muslims coming to Britain for 120 years, we have the first mosques going back 100 years. They were interdenominational. They all came together for their Eid prayers, etc., and all their important calendar festivals. So historically, Muslims were far more likely to be under united umbrellas. I think in the 70s and 80s, when different population centers started to grow, then we would get, this is the Kashmiri division here and another Kashmiri division there, or this is a Bengali mosque, or this is a Wahhabi mosque, and these kinds of things came later. And they did so because there was a time when there wasn't any regulation or organization, and people just did their own thing. After having come under one umbrella, they began to do their own thing. And now we're so split apart, it's really difficult. I know the Muslim Council of Britain and some great activities, and I know some fantastic work. And in the past, I was also involved in committees, and very happy to offer my help to any Muslim organization anytime I'm called upon, as long as it's reasonable, and it always is. And I think that's what you've got to be able to do. You've got to be able to, this is back to the self or the other. If you think yourself as a traditional Pakistani man, then your idea of who you are is going to be slightly different from how you see a Turkish person or a Moroccan person, and so on. And we have to kind of break down these ideas of thinking and actively promote the kinds of things that are important for us as a whole going forward around thinking about differences and how to bridge differences and how to use the Islamic knowledge to we have some of the most powerful anti-racist messages within Islam. The Prophet's last sermon is the most powerful anti-racist message in human history. It's again, it's all there. It's a diverse place. When people go to Hajj, they get all excited about diversity and we're all the same under the one sky. But coming back to our local communities in inner city Bradford or Birmingham or Bethnal Green, etc., people will have very distinct ideas about who they are and who they are not. And this is part of the fact that we're all living in these kinds of divided camps, and we are working within these tribal units. And we've got to be much smarter than this and think much more around collective interests and collective needs and wants, which is also part of the kind of multicultural discourse. Let's work around what's important for all of us, not about, this is important for the Pakistanis, this is important for the Yemeni, this is important for the Iraqis. We need to see all of these pictures together as one. And that requires a lot of effort. And especially on the part of Muslims as well. We can't say that the problems are all outside. We have to think about it. We are tribal, we are sectarian, we are sometimes racialist as well. We've got to get rid of all of that, big time, big time.
Well, Professor Tahir, Tahir Abbas, thank you very much for your wonderful presentation and lots of difficult questions. I'm sorry that there's lots of questions keep coming, because obviously we have to manage all these questions and within this short period of time. Now is over to you for final thought. You can have a 2-3 minutes final thought before I conclude in our today's session.
Well, thank you very much for the opportunity here, really, to try and talk about these kinds of issues. And I think it was important to talk about leadership in particular today, especially given the change that's afoot in America with the end of Trump, not the end of Trumpism. And I think this could mean better things for Europe, the European Union for sure, and certainly perhaps also for how Brexit pans out. And these are important discussions for us, even on our local community levels, while we're watching some of these things on our television screens. But there are so many issues to think about, and there's so many challenges out there. But I think what we can do at the level of the individual is to focus on ourselves, to be open, understanding, listening, engaging human beings, acting as an ambassador for the faith sometimes. In a world where there's automatic Islamophobia sometimes, you have to work a little bit harder. But I assure you that the vast majority of the world is in a much better place than we often hear and think about. And it's not always doom and gloom. Most people are good and can do good. And Confucianism argued that we all have the power to be great for all. It's within us. And I believe that. I believe we have the potential to do good things. And our faith teaches all of these things. But we have to remain a listening human being and engaging, and of course, you stand up for your rights and don't get knocked about, and be aware that there are many people who are sharing the same thoughts and ideas. So build alliances, bridge those connections. The young are doing this automatically. It's people like myself, my generation and older. We think that we're in another time sometimes, but younger folks are automatically much better at this than we are, and we should give them all the space and all the encouragement to let them take things forward in a positive way.
Well, thank you very much for your final thought and for your time, and for our viewers, those who are watching on the Facebook Live. We try our best to pick up some of the questions you or in your comment box of the Facebook MPF Facebook. We try our best to pick up some of the questions. It was not possible to pick up all of them, but our discussion and debate, and this is recorded, it will be available on the Facebook. You can continuously make your comment, and you can share your ideas and how we can build a better society for all. For tonight, after end of this session, I would like to say thank you very much for your time and patience. And if you if you have any problem from our side, anything we said something shouldn't be saying, I would like to say that probably it was our unintended, and then we just think that you will be good and safe in this situation of COVID. And obviously, finally, that Muslim communities, those are living in the West, we have the responsibilities. In the West, in the UK and other Western European countries, that we have a responsibility to do our part, because obviously the issue that is Islamophobia and radicalization, and also the other issues involved in here is going hand in hand. We have a responsibility to show leaderships in terms of leadership from the political leaders and also the community leaders, and hope that our leaders, those are listen this evening session, they will take some initiative, and obviously we'll look forward to work with you all and hope to see you in the future. So thank you very much. Assalamu alaikum. Good evening.